Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the IUCN Bear Specialist Group North American Bears Expert Team webinar series. It's nice to be back from the summer break, something we do every year to accommodate our team members' field seasons. Chris and I want to welcome NABIT members as well as other BSG expert team members in attendance today. We also want to welcome folks from the IBA Bear Managers Committee who are also attending today's webinar. Both groups were pretty interested in hosting this webinar, so we decided to join forces and just do it once. We hope more cross-team projects will arise in the future. So we've got a large group today, so let's go ahead and get started. Today's presentation is from an invited speaker, Katherine Kurth, who was referred to us by a couple of NABIT team members who are also co-authors on this project, Heather Johnson and Joe Clark. Katherine works for the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center. She uses quantitative research methods and science synthesis to study the effects of climate change on wildlife with an emphasis on human-wildlife interactions. Her background is in wildlife population modeling and health surveillance, and she focuses on developing practical strategies for climate adaptation. The title of her webinar today is A Systematic Review of the Effects of Climate Variability and Change on Brown and Black Bear Ecology and Conflict. Like always, we'll finish today's webinar within 1 hour to respect everybody's time, and don't forget you can use the chat function to ask questions at any time. But questions will be answered at the end of the presentation when we open it up for a panel discussion and audience participation. If you haven't already, please mute your microphones. And most folks, please turn off your cameras to preserve our bandwidth on this Zoom call. And with that said, we want to welcome Katherine. So Katherine, please take it away.
Thanks, Rich. I'll share my screen. Okay, so as Rich said, I'm a postdoc with the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center. For those of you who don't know, the Climate Adaptation Science Centers are a network of 1 national and 9 regional centers across the US that examine the impacts of climate change on fish, wildlife, and ecosystems to support adaptation planning. Today, I'm here to talk to you about climate impacts on bears with a particular focus on interactions with humans. So I'm going to start by giving you an introduction to climate effects on wildlife and interactions with humans. Next, I'm going to share results from our recently published systematic review on the effects of climate on brown and black bear ecology and interactions with humans. I'm also going to briefly share some of our current work related to human-bear interactions in Maryland. And then I'm going to end with some key takeaways. With that, I'll dive straight into introducing how climate can impact wildlife with a focus on interactions with humans. In today's presentation, I'm going to be using the terms climate variability and climate change. These terms are very similar, but they're also distinct. So I'll define how I'll describe them throughout the presentation. Climate variability refers to interannual or interdecadal fluctuations in temperature and precipitation. So the easiest way to think about this is the term weather. On the other hand, climate change refers to persistent multi-decadal deviations from long-term averages. So one is looking at very short-term events, whereas the other is deviations or changes from a long-term trend. Changes in climate we're already experiencing include a rise of global temperatures. And with that, we're seeing shifts in water availability, snow regimes, growing seasons, as well as an increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events and wildfires. This can cause a range of impacts to wildlife, and I'll describe some examples to you. So first, severe weather events such as storms, droughts, and heat waves or related hazards such as wildfires can directly harm wildlife and their habitats. Changes in climate can also impact phenology, which is the timing of events such as spring greenup. And when phenological shifts occur, events that previously overlapped can become unsynchronized. And when this happens, it's referred to as phenological mismatch. And this phenomenon can have cascading ecological impacts when it occurs. Species are also shifting their geographic ranges in response to climate change. The most well understood movement is toward the poles and toward higher altitudes. Changes in temperature, precipitation, and sea levels can also alter or destroy habitats, resulting in fragmentation and altered food availability. And lastly, changes in climate have also facilitated pest and pathogen outbreaks. And these outbreaks occur because shifting environmental conditions enable some pathogens and their vectors to better survive and spread into new areas, and that can result in disease spread. Climate can also impact human-wildlife interactions, and this can occur in many ways, but one of the most well-documented is as long-term climate change and acute climate events alter environmental conditions, there are resulting changes in resource availability, such as habitat and food quality and quantity. This in turn influences the behavior, distributions, and demography of both humans and wildlife, and can lead to increased co-occurrence and competition between humans and some wildlife species. This increased co-occurrence and competition can lead to altered patterns of human-wildlife interactions. So human-wildlife interactions can be both positive or negative. The definition that we use for negative human-wildlife interactions is instances when coexistence is challenged by conflicting objectives or activities that result in adverse effects for human, wildlife, or both. This is also very commonly referred to as human-wildlife conflict, and I may use either term throughout this presentation. Negative human-wildlife interactions are a very significant global issue, and this is because negative human-wildlife interactions have a very wide geographic spread. They essentially occur everywhere where wildlife and humans co-occur. Many species also interact with humans, and that can result in more opportunities for negative interactions. Ultimately, what this results in is a lot of interactions, some of which are negative, but they're implicated in being a leading cause of global biodiversity loss. And they're also implicated in costing annual global losses of billions of dollars. Because of the significance of human-wildlife interactions and the increasing challenges resulting from climate change, there is growing support for investigating this topic and the relationships between the two. The first support is in the form of prominent literature, and I have some examples shown here. In 2021, Abrams published Human-Wildlife Conflict Under Climate Change, which is a perspective in science. In 2022, the IUCN published an issues brief where they stated that human-wildlife conflicts are becoming more frequent, serious, and widespread because of climate change. In 2023, Abrams published again Climate Change as a Global Amplifier of Human-Wildlife Conflict, and this was a review in Nature. So there is a lot of empirical evidence of negative human-wildlife interactions being exacerbated by weather, but climate change as a whole is currently under-recognized as a driver in the literature. Prior to starting our work on climate and human-wildlife interactions, we gauged interest from our partners and found both state and federal interest. The state interest we received resulted in the case study work that I'll briefly discuss later in the presentation. To determine if there was a need for more species-specific information, my colleague Kate Malpelli met with AFWA's Human-Wildlife Conflict Working Group in 2021, and it was at that meeting that they indicated strong interest in learning more about climate impacts on human-wildlife conflict, with black bears being a priority species. The prioritization of bears was unsurprising because while bears have significant intrinsic, cultural, and economic value, they are a primary focus of negative human-wildlife interaction dialogue in many places in North America. So for our work and throughout this presentation, I'll focus on black and brown bears. This is because black bears occur throughout most of North America, and brown bears, while much more limited in occupied range, are also implicated frequently in human-bear interactions and share similar conflict drivers to black bears. They also have a high tolerance for anthropogenic activity and adapt very well to human food sources. So what this results in is that they're both commonly implicated in negative interactions with humans. And in fact, there are tens of thousands of bear-related complaints submitted in Mexico, the United States, and Canada per year. There are many types of conflicts that are represented in those reports, including vehicular collisions, property encroachment, livestock depredation, apiary destruction, and in the most extreme cases, attacks or physical altercations with humans. And what this results in is agencies spending an enormous amount of time and money to manage these human-bear interactions. In fact, managing human-bear conflict has been referred to as one of the most challenging priorities that wildlife managers face. The significant impacts of human development, human disturbance, and human population growth on human-bear interactions in North America are very well studied. Similarly, the literature provides a broad view of how weather affects bears directly and indirectly. However, climate also significantly impacts bears, and it's likely a compounding factor for bears already exposed to these other non-climate interaction drivers. But the research highlighting the growing importance of understanding the role of climate in exacerbating the frequency and severity of interactions is currently limited in the literature. So to address this gap, we conducted a systematic review to provide a consolidated resource to help managers recognize the effects of climate impacts on bear behavior and demography, as well as the implications for negative interactions, so they can proactively and efficiently allocate their management resources. The authors on this paper include researchers from across multiple USGS centers and include Kate Malpelli, Joe Clark, Heather Johnson, Frank Van Manen, and myself. Our review was published earlier this year in Biological Conservation. I'm going to go over the highlights of our work, but please feel free to download the paper if you'd like to dig deeper into any of the subjects. It is open source and free to download and read. There are a few reasons why we conducted a systematic review rather than a non-systematic review. First, systematic reviews use a structured and rigorous methodology to identify, evaluate, and synthesize relevant studies. And so the goal of that is to result in a more comprehensive review and coverage. Second, by following a defined protocol and using criteria for study selection and data extraction, systematic reviews minimize the risk of bias, providing more objective results. And lastly, the detailed documentation of the protocol and process allows other researchers to better understand exactly how the data was obtained and replicate or add to the review at a later date if desired. So I'm going to go over the methods that we used to conduct this review. The first step was the literature retrieval process. And to retrieve literature, we searched both Scopus and Web of Science using a standardized and structured search string. This search string required at least one population term of Ursus americanus or Ursus arctos in the title, abstract, or keywords of the article. It also required at least one climate variability and change term. And you can see here we included a very wide range of both climate variability and change terms to make sure that we were able to retrieve as much literature as possible. We did not include articles that highlighted body temperature as a keyword, as that helped us eliminate irrelevant chemical mobilization studies. We also obtained literature through additional sources. The first was a reverse snowball technique, where we looked at the literature cited of accepted papers to identify any articles that we may have otherwise missed. The second was opportunistic retrieval, where we were able to include articles we knew were relevant, but otherwise weren't picked up by the search string. With those articles, we conducted title and abstract screening using 2 reviewers as it was more robust. We reviewed the title and abstract for the following criteria. First, the study had to involve free-ranging Ursus americanus or Ursus arctos in North America. The study also had to document the exposure of black or brown bears to direct climate variables or their derivatives. Third, the study had to make a comparison between at least 2 different time points, and that was so that we could really hone in on what the exposure or how the exposure was impacting the bears. And lastly, the study had to document a bear response to the exposure variables. For literature that made it past that point, they were assessed for relevance on the full text. For articles that met the same criteria as I just described after reading the full article, they had their data extracted, including bibliographic information, climate and weather variables, as well as the bear response. As a result, we retrieved 852 articles from Scopus and Web of Science, and 120 of those articles were deemed relevant and included in the synthesis. Out of those articles, 62% of articles studied black bears and 43% studied brown bears. People who are quick at math may notice that those do add to over 100%, and that's because some of the articles studied both. Similarly, 75% of articles studied bears in the United States, 23% of articles studied bears in Canada, and 5% studied bears in Mexico. And on the left, you can see a map showing the number of studies within each state or province within our review. And you can see that there's a higher concentration of literature or a higher number of studies in the northwestern portion of North America. There was a wide variety of exposure variables represented in the literature, with temperature, precipitation, and snow depth having the highest number of studies. However, drought, fire, and flood were also well represented in the literature. There was also a wide variety of bear responses studied in the literature. We categorized each of these bear responses into review categories, which included body size, denning chronology, diet, population demographics and dynamics, and habitat selection, space use, and activity. There were also 17 studies that directly investigated climate impacts on conflict or negative interactions with humans. Using those results, we created a conceptual map to begin to assess the relationships between climate and each of those bear categories. The literature supported that climate variability and change impacted bear habitat and food quality and quantity. This in turn affected each of our review categories, including denning chronology, population dynamics, diet, body condition, and habitat selection. However, we also found direct impacts for climate variability and change on 3 of those categories. And ultimately, each of those categories had implications for human-bear interactions. I'm going to share results for 3 of the bear response categories. If you're particularly interested in one of the other categories, the review is organized by category, so you should be able to find the information fairly quickly within the paper. So we'll start with the climate and weather impacts on natural food and diet. The literature supported that climate and weather impacted primary productivity, phenology, and plant and animal distribution, in turn influencing the quantity, quality, and accessibility of certain foods. For example, drought was consistently implicated in natural food shortages for black and brown bears, including reducing vegetation and mast availability, limiting cutthroat trout, and reducing ungulate carrion. Similarly, wildfire also affected food resources, but those effects were a little more mixed. Wildfire was implicated in reducing habitat quality and loss of understory vegetation, but wildfire can also promote early successional vegetation growth for a period of time, as well as temporarily increase carrion. The implications of those impacts for bears is that their diets are largely impacted by what foods are available to eat. So shifts in food availability directly impacted bear diet composition. Both brown and black bears will readily adapt to accessible food sources. The literature also supported that bear foraging behaviors were impacted by conditions such as temperature, precipitation, and snowmelt. As an example from the literature, the diets of black and grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem were comprised of a greater percentage of ants and biscuit root, when preferred foods such as white bark pine seeds and trout were limited. Bears often responded to natural food shortages by seeking human food sources. This can have implications for human-bear interactions, as natural food shortages were found to be a principal driver of human-bear interactions in North America as bears seek human food sources. Livestock depredation, attacks on humans, garbage scavenging, and home intrusions by bears were all linked to natural food shortages. For example, in the Lake Tahoe Basin, a drought-caused natural food failure was accompanied by a 16 to 17-fold increase in human black bear conflict. So as drought and other climate changes lead to natural food shortages, bears are anticipated to adapt by either increasing their reliance on lower quality natural foods or by seeking human foods to meet those energy requirements. Behavioral changes resulting from low natural food availability, such as that reliance on human foods, can be reversed, but it can also be really challenging, particularly as these behaviors may be passed on to offspring. So this pattern could have mounting implications for human-bear coexistence. So what are the projected climate impacts? Well, disturbance events that can impact natural food availability, such as droughts, fires, and hurricanes, may increase in frequency and severity in some regions. Changes in climate may also threaten persistence of some high-calorie, hard mass foods, alter the availability of carrion, and impact suitable habitat for key berry and root-producing plants. Climate changes can also result in phenological mismatch. This has already occurred in Alaska during uncharacteristically warm years, during which two key foods of brown bears became synchronized. During that time, bears had an excess of preferred foods during one period, but then neither food source were available in another period. For some forage species, the effect of climate change could be positive and or negative. For example, if the climate becomes warmer and drier, increased fire could limit interspecies competition for white bark pine and reduce the spread of white pine blister rust. On the other hand, it could also increase the probability of mountain pine beetle infestations. So while there is some uncertainty, projected changes in climate suggest that bear diets will continue to shift in response to changes in food availability, distribution, and phenology, and resulting human-bear interactions are likely to continue, if not increase, in frequency and severity. Shifting to the results of the denning chronology category, the literature supported that changes in precipitation and temperature impacted denning timing and duration. Warmer temperatures have been associated with delayed den entry and early den emergence, and decreased precipitation, earlier snowmelt, rapid snowmelt, or even inconsistent snowmelt have all been associated with earlier den emergence. For example, black bears in Colorado hibernated 6 fewer days for each 1 degree increase in winter minimum temperature. Changes in food availability also can impact denning timing and duration, and this may be most pronounced for bears with low body condition. For example, in Alberta, berry availability within grizzly bear home ranges explained 39% of observed den entry variation, and a 10-fold increase in preferred plant productivity delayed den entry by approximately 2 weeks. So this can have implications for human-bear interactions, as shorter denning duration is expected, which could increase interactions with humans because of the amount of time that humans and bears are active together on the landscape. Early den emergence could lead to increased human-bear interactions if bears emerge when natural food is limited and turn to anthropogenic food sources as well. However, it is possible that vegetation availability and bear activity will remain synchronous in some areas. So as global temperatures continue to rise, shorter denning duration is expected. In Colorado, projected climate conditions are estimated to decrease the duration of black bear hibernation by 8 to 22 days by 2050 as an example. And bears may adapt and exhibit similar denning chronology patterns to contemporary bears at lower latitudes. And this is because climate shifts experienced in more northern latitudes may reflect the current climate of areas in southern latitudes. Now we'll transition to the results of the habitat selection section of the review. The literature supported that habitats need to allow for thermoregulation, adequate nutrition, and shelter, which can all be directly impacted by climate variability and change. Thermoregulation may be particularly challenged as temperatures increase and create thermal constraints for bears. Habitat quality, cover, and dens can all be impacted directly by wildfire, flooding, and tornadoes, as well as natural food availability being impacted by changing climate conditions, including sea level rise, wildfire, and extreme weather. This can have implications for bears because when bears are unable to meet their physiologic needs in areas where they reside, they often search for resources elsewhere, which can result in increased home ranges or dispersal. For example, a drought-induced mass failure was implicated in the migration and dispersal of nearly an entire Texas black bear population. Bears may also seek resources near or in human-inhabited areas due to weather conditions, reduced habitat quality, and natural food failures. And lastly, bears use various techniques to thermoregulate, such as submerging in water sources and digging daybeds down to mineral soil in warm temperatures, and selecting dens in areas with greater snowpack depth and cover in colder areas. But thermoregulation and these techniques may be challenged as temperatures increase. This can have implications for human-bear interactions because thermoregulating at water sources congregates livestock and bears in some areas, increasing conflict risk. Bears may also seek resources near human-inhabited areas due to weather conditions, reduced habitat quality, and natural food failures. And this leads to increased risk of negative human-bear interactions, as well as ecological traps or population sinks. For example, a late June freeze resulted in a natural food shortage in Colorado and increased use of human foods by bears. During the food shortage year, lethal conflict removals and harvests were double the annual average, and bear vehicular collisions were quadruple the 5-year average. And what this resulted in is female black bear abundance declined by 57%. So what are the projected climate impacts? Well, shifts in bear habitat availability and quality are projected to continue in the face of climate change. This could occur in many ways, but have significant impacts. For example, linkages between suitable areas of black bear habitat in the Southeast are projected to decrease 16% by mid-century under high emission scenarios. Similarly, as global temperatures increase, tree lines are expected to shift to higher elevations, reducing an important but already small and dispersed habitat for grizzly bears such as alpine ecotones. When bear ranges were modeled under greenhouse gas emission scenarios in a 2018 study, black bears were the only apex predator species out of the 5 studies after the 5 studied that were actually anticipated to increase their distribution by 2050 and 2070. And this is likely due to their generalist qualities and high adaptability. On the other hand, brown bear distribution was predicted to decline under all scenarios, and that was likely because much of their current range includes biomes undergoing rapid temperature increases, such as boreal forests and tundra. So changes in range will likely increase negative interactions with humans if those ranges overlap anthropogenic areas, particularly those that are unequipped or unprepared to manage conflict. So there are some data gaps and limitations to acknowledge from this work. The first is that there were consistent trends across geographic location and species, but studies were unevenly distributed throughout North America. For example, only 6 studies assessed black bears in Mexico, which may have been because we ran our literature searches in English. So future research is needed to fill identified gaps in bear responses and geographic gaps in the data. Evidence was also limited for some subjects. For example, within the US and Canada, only 4 studies examined the effects of climate on body condition, and only 2 studies examined disease outcomes. Sample size was also limited in many studies, sometimes 10 or fewer bears, and this was likely associated with the difficulty and expense of studying bears and their relatively low densities on the landscape. There's also a potential bias in representing human-bear interactions using public reports to state management agencies. These reports can be biased because reporting can be influenced by a lot of external factors, such as social factors, but this type of data is typically the best that we have accessible and available. So overall, as a result of our synthesis, we found effects of climate on bear diet, body size, habitat selection, space use and activity, denning chronology, and population demographics and dynamics. Climate-driven natural food shortages were implicated in bear responses in every synthesized category. Many of the examined effects had the potential to alter the frequency and severity of human-bear interactions. And while black and brown bears exhibit behavioral plasticity, they'll increasingly face challenges if their ability to adapt is outpaced by the rate of climate change, extreme climate events, and impacts of interactions with humans. So because of this, there are some management implications to consider. First, it will become increasingly important for managers to incorporate climate considerations, particularly those impacting natural food availability, into bear management strategies. It is prudent to use rigorous methods that can effectively track trends in bear populations and incorporate multiple data types and relevant variables such as weather and natural food conditions. Bears will face increased non-harvest human-caused mortality as their active season lengthens and bears seek out human food sources. So accounting for climate and subsequent changes in habitat when assessing management decisions such as harvest limits will allow for more effective and proactive management. The literature also supported restricting bear access to anthropogenic foods, particularly during natural food shortages. And the strategies in the literature likely to yield the greatest success include requiring and enforcing attractant management ordinances, such as the use of bear-resistant trash cans, as well as using effective deterrents such as electric fencing and implementing livestock husbandry practices that reduce depredation risk. And lastly, maintaining access to and connections among quality habitat areas is imperative to enhancing species resilience to climate change. Now I'm going to transition to briefly talking about some of our other related work that we recently submitted for publication. We wanted to investigate what quantitative insights managers could get from investigating climate and weather impacts in regards to managing human-bear interactions. So for this, I worked with Jonathan Trudeau, the game mammal section leader of Maryland Department of Natural Resources. So for some background on Maryland, the state has the 4th highest number of reported complaints per 10,000 people in the country. And because of that, there are substantial resources that are dedicated to managing human-bear interactions. However, no formal analysis on the drivers of human-bear interactions has been conducted. And while managers typically have a deep understanding of where interactions historically and currently occur, they lack quantitative measures needed to predict where interactions will take place under changing conditions. So to meet this need, we used Maryland Department of Natural Resources human-bear interaction reports with GPS locations. We evaluated 15 different variables, including land cover, anthropogenic, and drought-related variables, and assess the relationships between those using advanced machine learning techniques to analyze the variables, as well as predict areas with high interaction risk. From these results, we were able to create predictive maps to show predicted interaction risk during neutral and summer drought conditions across the state. I'm not allowed to share specific results yet as it hasn't gone through the internal USGS review process yet, but some of our preliminary insights included that we identified substantial quantitative evidence that there's increased risk in negative human-bear interactions from drought, and this was also reflected in our synthesis results. We were able to achieve very high predictive accuracy from our advanced machine learning model, and ultimately our results allow for state partners to implement proactive management and preparation in areas with emerging negative interactions. So the key takeaways from all of this work, including the synthesis as well as the quantitative work in Maryland, is that the adaptability of bears, especially black bears, allow them to adjust to changing conditions. Many of these adaptations, however, increase contact with humans and their reliance on anthropogenic resources, which can lead to negative human-bear interactions. So understanding the effects of climate to bears can help managers strategically allocate resources, guide decisions, support adaptation, and enhance human-bear coexistence. And with that, I'll take any questions. I know many of my co-authors are also on the call, so if you have anything to add, feel free to jump in. I'll extend that invitation.
Thanks, Katherine. Great job. We got some time, folks. Just real quickly, Sterling had a comment in the chat. He liked the features in your presentation. He's wondering, was it all made in PowerPoint, a new version of it, or is it something different that you brought in?
That is PowerPoint. I'm a pretty big PowerPoint nerd, so my hot tip is look into the morph transition.
All right. Looking for some hands. Yeah, we got one. Cheng, go ahead.
Hello, Katherine. I'm very interested to see your work, and I just one question on the potential loss and gain of potential distribution. I'm wondering how many areas of that can be lost if this not distributes there at all. I'm just wondering.
So is your question referring to the map that I showed?
Yeah, in the figure 4, I think.
Yes, so that is out of some research by Penny and Paps, and I can drop the link to their work to give you more information about that. I don't know the specific quantified loss of habitat for brown bears and black bears off the top of my head, but I can get you that article so that you can dig deeper.
Okay, thank you. It's just I'm trying to be criticized because I'm working on mapping I'm a graduate student. I'm working on mapping ranges for Asia bears. So just feels confusing, like with the use of modeling technique, but it's how it can measure since it's not exist at all. So I mean, just be criticized. So never mind. But thanks for your answer.
All right. Thanks. Go ahead, Arjun.
Thanks. Awesome presentation, and great to be here. It's my first time at this, so really excited. I'm curious about the implications for the timing and length of harvest seasons and regulations if bears are kind of shifting towards having shorter denning periods. Do you have any thoughts on that, Katherine?
Yes, so that was in the literature a few times. I think one thing that's going to be increasingly important for managers to recognize is that differentiation in those active seasons. So if seasons are currently set up to protect females with cubs, for instance, if they're emerging from dens sooner, then there could be increased mortality that's unintended from the agency perspective. So really assessing that and being mindful of that moving forward is going to become increasingly important. It's a great point.
Thanks, Arjun. Michael, go ahead.
Hey, that was a really great review. It's really fun to see those reviews, kind of update all that information. Mine's more of a comment and maybe a little bit related to Ching Ching's thing. I just redid the Canadian bear occupied range, and it was really fun in the Arctic because I think we're using the older IUCN distribution in your map. And it was really moving north farther, well up into the Arctic islands. Pretty cool. But there is some shrinkage, but I think that was mostly caused, pre-climate change impacts. But anyway, in general, the brown bear distribution is certainly expanding. And I'm sure a lot of that related to what you talked about. But anyway, thanks again.
Thanks, Michael. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Katherine, for participating in this as a speaker in the BSG NABIT webinar series. It's a great addition. I wonder if I could sort of offer a bit of a criticism, though, that I think that we should keep in mind, and that is that every time we talk about human-bear interactions or human-bear conflicts, as bear biologists, we often stress the people side of the equation. It's very often shifted to that. And in fact, almost all the management that we do has to do with people, not with bears specifically. And there's a lot of pushback against using harvest as a tool to manage bears because it's all about people. It's about people. And you talked about data gaps, but the biggest data gap is that in climate change, there will be number one, a redistribution of people. There will be different land use by people. There will be different knowledge levels 50 years in the future on what to do, different methods, different tools that we can use and things like that. But that's all missing sort of from the review. And I understand that that'd probably be hard to do, but I don't know if other other authors incorporate the people aspect of it. But that's going to be, I think, the major driving factor in human-bear interactions in the future, not the bears per se. And I'll just give you an example from my own career. I worked for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources for 37 years. And over that period, there was the development of short growing season corn, which was not there. When I first started, there wasn't corn in northern Minnesota. And then they developed a hybrid, and all of a sudden there's corn, which all of a sudden increased massively the number of conflicts that we had. And likewise, bird feeders. When I first started, people did not feed birds very much in the winter, and then it became the thing to do. And all of a sudden, everybody's feeding birds, and that massively increased the conflicts. And these things completely outswamp anything to do with like when the bears are denning. If they wake up 1 week early, that's absolutely trivial compared to what the people are doing and how many people live in different places. So I'll offer that as a comment, that I don't know if there's any way of ever incorporating that in models, but to me, it seems like that is the major missing kind of component.
That's definitely a very important piece, and we made sure to include in the review that climate is a confounding factor to some of those anthropogenic aspects, that by no means there's the assertion that this is the end all be all, the only thing affecting bears and driving interactions. There's certainly a significant anthropogenic aspect that we think, like I said, climate confounds. We, of course, were limited to what was retrieved in our search results or what's actually been investigated. And I would, of course, encourage anyone to look into those things. There are publications that do link climate to the movement of humans, and especially like a common example would be away from coastlines or away from some of those more hazardous areas as changing conditions occur. But I don't think at this point I came across any articles that specifically discuss that in relation to bear distribution. So you're right that that is a gap, but hopefully we did acknowledge that climate change is a confounding factor to those anthropogenic drivers within the review.
Right. And I'll just add that, I mean, I come from, the reason that we have so few people living in northern Minnesota is because of the climate. And if that changes and we get 10 times more people here, then the food supply of bears and the denning chronology of bears is completely irrelevant compared to the redistribution of people or how people use the landscape.
Yeah, those interactions will certainly all be working in conjunction to create a new dynamic.
Right. A new dynamic that I would argue is completely unpredictable. That's my opinion. But to suggest that we can predict 50 years into the future what the interactions with bears is going to be by looking at the bear side of things, I just can't see that if we don't know what the people side of things is. And furthermore, I'm just going to add one last thing, and I'll let Carl go. What's also missing from this is our knowledge of sort of technology. When I first started, we didn't even have PCs. We were trying to manage a bear population with pencil and paper and calculators. And, all of a sudden we have PCs and we have software. And I remember the day when we got email. It was like, wow, we can actually talk to people. So what's it going to be 50 years from now in terms of our technology and what we use to manage bears? We didn't have bear-proof dumpsters, and we have that now. It's like a very basic thing. Or electric fences. What's that going to be 50 years from now? I think it's all completely unpredictable. That'd be my argument.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Things that we can do today, but definitely uncertainty as we move forward decades.
Yeah.
What I heard from that was us Canadians got to build that fence pretty soon.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
No, good conversation starter. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, Dave beat me to it on that. I was just going to mention that when we look at increasing human bear conflict and interactions over time, we definitely have to look at that redistribution geographically of people, and we see that a lot here with people, more and more people moving from the urban centers to the rural areas. And with this expanding population that we've seen in Nevada over the last couple decades, we used to get the calls all the time, people saying, I've lived here 30 years and this is the first bear I saw. And now it's, well, I've lived here a year and a half and this is the first bear I saw. They're just the number of people moving out of the urban centers, primarily from our neighbor state to the west, has definitely had an influence on our interactions. So thanks. Great job. Great presentation.
Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, Lana. Oh, got you on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you for your presentation, Katherine. I think Dave made some great points there, but just following up on something Mike said that you might want to consider here, as we are seeing these expanding populations of grizzly bears in Canada in certain places. And what we see a lot is that competition between the species now. So the grizzly bears are essentially pushing the black bears out. And it doesn't even sort of matter if it's the forested habitat or not. I can give you an example. I had a black bear that was all over a grain issue for years, raising its family there. And a grizzly bear came in this expansion, ate the entire family, and now has that part of her home range, right? So I really think that that is also, in addition to those things that Dave said, that are really great there with those points of predicting the future and urban expansion. The competition aspect, when you're looking at those range expansions, is going to affect how you're predicting, I think. But thank you for your talk.
It's a great point. Polar bears as well, the movement northward.
Go ahead, Sterling.
Yes, I really enjoyed the presentation, particularly all those PowerPoint features that you say are hidden in there somewhere that I'll have to investigate that.
You can talk after, Sterling.
And I think what the points that Dave and Carl made are good ones, but ignoring those for the moment, I'm interested in one of the main features of climate change is an increase in severe weather. I here in Montana, we just have really had a remarkable spate of really severe weather, which is a component of your analysis, which seems to be missing. I'm wondering whether or not you think that that's worth investigating or not.
And so when you say extreme weather, is there something like a specific phenomenon you're referring to?
Winds. I mean, you could think of hurricanes and tornadoes and windstorms.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't one particular.
And droughts and rain.
Yes.
And so increased unpredictability of those. So
yes. So that was definitely something that we found in the literature. For example, there were direct effects of tornadoes, flooding, drought on habitats. But really the largest driver that we saw consistently throughout the literature was that indirect effect through the habitat quality and food availability pathway. So we certainly have effects. If you go into the population demographics section of the review, we do talk about how fire can influence cub survival, for example. So it is in there, just focused on this presentation on more of the indirect impacts, as it was much more prominent in the literature.
All right. Well, last call. Anyone have anything pressing? We got a few minutes. Go ahead, Diana.
Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, because there is something wrong with my microphone, so I was wondering. So my question was related to the fact if you have, because we had a lot of discussion among our colleagues, we have a lot of bear attacks on humans lately, especially in Slovakia and in Romania, with really casualties. And we were wondering whether the severe climate changes and events might be influencing somehow the behavior of the bears when a human-bear encounter happened. For example, on a forest trail or somewhere in the forest. Have you ever looked into this respect?
Yes. So I would think that there would be something, of course, something else underlying that, like a food availability issue or a habitat encroachment issue. There is one example that comes to mind out of Alaska. I just saying the numbers off the top of my head, so please double check me. But I believe that they found that attacks on humans increased 20% for each 50% reduction in fish, so in fish biomass. So that would be, I think you dropped your email in the chat. I can send you that resource as well, but I know of at least one publication that did find that that correlation for physical altercations.
No, we were discussing more in a line of fact. For example, we had a really extreme temperature, something like 35 to 40 degrees in areas which are not very typical for these temperatures. And we were wondering whether these very high temperatures for these unusually high temperatures for these areas are somehow affecting the moods of the bears, let's to speak. Just urging them to be more nervous, creating a very nervous break, let's say, that they tend to attack humans more often.
Well, I know I can get angry when it gets hotter, but in terms of the literature, I didn't see anything directly correlating temperature to truly a behavioral response like that without an underlying factor like being in more shaded areas or changing their daily activity or their range throughout the day. Those sorts of things are present in the literature, but I have yet to see like a truly behavioral or psychological analysis of that.
Yeah.
It's an interesting point though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bring us home, Chris.
Excellent presentation. It was great to hear all the great stuff you put together there. And I want to highlight that issue that came up about more people in bear habitat. What this seems to be doing is reducing the resiliency of bears to the climate change impacts. For example, in Montana, we've lost over 400,000 hectares of private land to development. So those were formerly undeveloped lands that are now filled with people. The population in Montana has increased 35% in the past 40 years. And many of those people are moving into places that are spring range for bears. And that's where the public land is higher up the mountains, and then down low on the edge is where the people are developing. And then if the bears are going to be out early, they're going to be in those places where those people now are. And so that loss of resilience is a real serious impact to these bears, because as you've documented, these climate change impacts are ongoing. And on top of that, the humans are taking away the ability for bears to live in places successfully, because when they're down there, they're getting into conflicts with people. And it's a compounding effect across the landscape. And one other thing I'd like to point up is we had a workshop on projected climate change impacts to bears almost 12 years ago on the US-Canadian area, our transboundary area. And the number one impact that was predicted by all the bear biologists in the room of climate change was going to be the increasing number of people that would move into the more hospitable areas of the Northern Rockies in the US and Southern Rockies in Canada, because it's a lot more fun place to live than, say, Tucson, where it's 40 degrees continuously. So that was the predicted number one impact that was coming out of that, was that more of these people are going to be in bear habitat. And what do we do about that? I don't know, but I just want to congratulate you again on your presentation and with your co-authors of putting this together. It's an excellent summary. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll reiterate, some of my co-authors are on the call today, so kudos to all their hard work as well. They're in it just as much as me.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Frank threw a link in there on how well we can predict climate migration, a review of forecasting models. So that's another thing to look at. But yeah, thanks, Katherine, for doing this, and to you and all your co-authors for getting this conversation spurred up again. You're hearing a lot of comments, more so than questions, which I think is really good, because that's what the publication process is all about too, is getting people talking and more focused on this real issue that we're facing. So thanks a bunch. Thanks to everyone that attended.